Have you ever struggled for confidence entering a corner? Other riders are able to send it in there deep, flick the bike with confidence and make the apex. Or perhaps you're on the brakes, braking as hard as you possibly can, and someone goes by you on the inside and can still confidently make the turn. We've all been there. You know who you are. This is Eric Wood, and welcome to GasonBikeUp. In over 30 plus years of track riding and 25 years of coaching thousands of students at all different levels, I found a couple of things that riders can use to help with both of those situations. Let's get started. I've always been a front-end heavy rider. In the course of my racing career, I tended to always make my time on the way in, on the brakes, and during turn-in. But it wasn't always that way. Early in my career, especially as I moved into the pro ranks, I found myself in the situations that I described at the beginning of this video. Going in as hard as I could, finding riders who could pass me and go faster on the way in, and yet still make the corner with no problem. What were they doing differently? To enter a corner deep and use the front tire to its fullest, you need two things: grip and feel. Of course, to have grip, the first thing you need is weight, pushing the tire into the ground. That downward force. The more downward force you have, the more grip you have for both turning and braking. The most common mistake, both in street riders and with over-aggressive racers, is too much brake, too fast. A very common street crash. Someone's going down the road, someone pulls out in front of them. What's the rider do? Boom! Grabs a whole bunch of brake all at once, before the weight has transferred to the front tire. This is why track riding is so important, and the habits you generate track riding can save your life. If you practice braking at maximum on the racetrack with the proper technique, when that happens, when the day that truck pulls out in front of you, instead of just snatching the brake and tucking the front end and getting stuck underneath the truck, if you have the race training, your muscle memory will have you apply the brake lever in the most efficient way possible. Let's talk about what that looks like. The simple solution is to have the proper technique for the first 5% of your brakes. Effectively, you apply the brakes, then brake. It's a two-step process. Now sometimes the application is short, sometimes it takes a little while. It depends on the actual entrance itself. So what makes a difference? If the entrance is flat, that's our baseline. We might take a 1/1000. It's a few tenths of a second. It's a difference between snatching the brake lever all at once with your 50 pounds of pressure and loading it with 0, 5, 10 before you ramp up to that 50 pounds. It's apply, then brake. So for the sake of discussion, let's say that on the average flat corner, it takes half a second. It may be more, it may be less, but for the sake of our discussion, we'll say that that's our average application time on a flat corner. What affects that? What corners would you take more time or less time to apply the brakes? Well, if you're going, for example, downhill, where the track is falling away from you and you're accelerating at the same time, you have less weight on the front tire. As you're dropping down a hill on the gas, your bike's still trying to wheelie. So in those downhill entrances, you might take that half a second that you would use on a normal flat entrance, and that might go to 3/4 of a second or a full second, depending on how steep the downhill entrance is and how much time you need to allow that contact patch to spread out and give yourself the grip you need to fully apply those brakes. Another thing that may slow down the application is when the entrance is bumpy. We have a lot of tracks and roads that have bumps on the way in. And if those bumps are early in the brake zone, you'll want to take a little bit of extra time to apply the brakes. Why? Because you don't want to get to the bottom of the suspension. And if you look at suspension data, oftentimes the largest amount of travel you'll use, you get the closest to the bottom, is the initial brake application and the hardest braking zones. You have a big running start. You've gone from wide open, your bike's going down the straightaway, it's trying to wheelie, and you have all this momentum, boom. If you grab the brakes too quick, you can get right on the bottom. Now, if you're near the bottom and the track is feeding input from you from the bottom side up, now you get on the bottom of your suspension and you have all kinds of issues. Once you run out of suspension, all the extra load goes directly into the tire. The tire starts to mush and it can hop up and down. All kinds of things that get the bike upset on the way in and do not help your entrance speed or your ability to brake. More on that in a moment. Now, if you're in an instance where you have extra grip on the front tire, And this happens typically in uphill braking zones. You can sometimes even shorten that load. If half a second is our reference on a flat straightaway, you're going on an uphill entrance where you've got lots of extra load on the front tire, you might be able to shorten that up to 2 or 3/10 of a second. The other important part, the second part of our braking, after we've done the application, is the ramp to full pressure. Most riders simply go boom and they grab with a certain amount of force. They don't get anywhere near the maximum. They usually apply 30 or 40% and they make a guess. They kind of go, I apply, boom, this much. Braking at a higher level, it should be ramp, apply, a defined curve that looks almost like a shark fin. Once we get to maximum pressure, that's when the real braking really starts. The thing we have to remember is most braking zones only last 2 or 3 seconds. So anything you do to get the bike upset on the way in the corner gets the chassis moving up and down. You get a whopping 2 or 3 seconds for that to damp itself out. So this becomes a subjective matter where you want to ramp to full pressure as quickly as you can without getting the chassis upset. Now, if you get your bike moving up and down through the travel on the way in the corner, there are 2 distinct issues. One, once your suspension is moving up and down through the stroke, you no longer have the ability to get the full brake pressure. The second is, when your bike's moving up and down through the stroke, you're not going to flick the bike quickly at the end of the braking zone to get on the edge of the tire as quickly as you can and carry maximum roll speed. You're going to tend to go, and tip it in slowly and carefully, which is not going to get you to the apex pointed in the right direction and will tend to make you late to the throttle. So when you're going down the straightaway, you start with your forks at an extended level. Let's say you've got a 600-pound combined bike and rider, and you've got 100 pounds on the front wheel and 500 pounds on the rear wheel. What you want to do is get your contact patch spread out and then get your suspension into the location where it's going to be carrying your maximum amount of load, but not beyond that. Let's say on your full braking, you've got virtually all of your weight on the front tire and almost none on the rear. You've got basically a 600-0 balance. We're not talking about picking it up in the air because that obviously causes us to release brake pressure, but right on that edge where the back tire is just skimming on the ground, that's the limit for braking. So when we go from a 100-pound to a 600-pound level on our forks, we want to get there so it goes, whoa! So it's a slight overshoot, right? It's impossible to go from a nearly topped out fork level at full acceleration perfectly down to your maximum brake level without a small amount of overshoot. We want the bike to go boom and settle once. You want to have that constant level the whole way through the brake zone, so you not only have a consistent amount of grip with the front tire, but you also have a consistent feel with the front end. You know exactly how much bar pressure you can use at the end of the brake zone to turn the bike in. You're not guessing, because as the bike goes up and down through the travel, you're getting more grip, less grip, more grip, less grip. And you also have less trail, more trail. As the forks are compressed, the bike turns easier. As the forks are extended, the bike turns harder. So how do you know? Easier, harder, easier, harder, easier, harder. How do you find the timing? You don't. When you have a bike that's moving like that up and down through the travel, you back off a step and tip in slowly and effectively leave yourself extra margin for error as a result of the bike getting the bike upset. So again, the ramp to full pressure is a subjective thing. It's going to take practice, and you have to develop some muscle memory of how you can, on your bike with your settings, get your bike to that maximum load. There, of course, are suspension settings that affect this. Plenty of that in another video. Right now, we're going to focus on the most important suspension component, and that's the rider. Your inputs at the controls will have more effect than almost anything you do with the clickers, unless you're way out of the range. So why does when the bike get upset limit your max brake pressure? And this is a big secret. Sometimes riders try to get in too fast, too hard, and this is almost the first step of an amateur rider who's trying to keep up with a bunch of experts. The first move for most of those riders is simply to send it in deeper. Get in there deeper and grab the brakes harder. Often track day riders do the same thing. I'm going to go keep up with the rider in front of me, I'm going to send it in there deeper. What sets the maximum amount of bar pressure you can use? What sets your maximum brake force? What happens on a modern motorcycle? Now, of course, assuming that you have spread out your contact patch and you have full grip to brake with, modern tires don't lock up as a general rule under full brake pressure. What happens, and you've seen this with all top racers in the world, whether it be World Superbike or MotoGP, they begin to lift the back tire up off the ground. And when that back tire comes off the ground, that sets the limit for how much brake pressure you can use. Once that tire begins to peel off, you can't apply any more brake pressure without making that worse. So that is your limiting factor. So what affects how soon your rear tire comes off the ground? And the answer is your center of gravity. The lower the center of gravity, the more braking force you can apply before the back tire comes off the ground. The higher the center of gravity, the faster the bike will tip forward. In general, when your weight is higher on the motorcycle, you get more transfer back and forth, and as a result, you get more exaggerated suspension motion. You want to wheelie more? Sit up higher. You want to do an easier stoppie? Sit up higher. You want the bike to stay planted on the ground on exits? Drop your body on the exits. You want the bike to be more stable on the brakes? Make sure your chassis in the center of gravity is lower. So those riders that get on the brakes too hard, too fast, as their bike goes up and down through the travel, they're limited to the maximum amount of brake pressure that is at the very top of that motion. Because of course, if the thing's oscillating back and forth a couple times a second, you can't possibly modulate the brakes at that same rate. You're limited to the max pressure at the highest point of that oscillation. So the secret there is that in an important braking zone, it can often be faster to brake slightly earlier and smoother, because as you get to the meat of the brake zone, you can then apply higher lever pressure and slow yourself down more efficiently. And the bonus is the control you have that allows you to brake also allows you significantly better entrance speed, because your bike's more under control, you make a faster turn in and get to the apex with better direction. And that's where the speed really comes from. So let's say you're doing a pretty good job setting a smooth ramp and applying the brake pressure in the same manner, but you're still getting outbroken. What's another factor that can contribute to this? The problem with motion is when you get a running start. And of course, when you're on the throttle, that maximum acceleration, your bike's still trying to wheelie at the end of the straightaway. Of course, the faster you go, it runs out of the horsepower and it doesn't have the ability to wheelie anymore. But it's still trying. It is extending your forks as hard as it possibly can at the end of the straightaway. The entire braking zone begins with how you roll the throttle off. And there's a subtle change that can make a big difference in your riding. Many riders learn and apply this smooth application of the brake lever, but fewer riders actually engage on the process of shutting off the throttle smoothly. And there can be a big difference. Imagine you're on a 1000cc bike, like this one right here, 200 horsepower. Imagine the weight transfer that happens at 130 miles an hour at the top of fourth gear when you're wide open and you slam the throttle closed. What happens? You get an immediate whoa, pitch forward that begins the momentum that you then accentuate with extra brake force. How do you mediate that? Instead of what most riders do, where they let go of the throttle, they'll actually release it completely and let it snap, boom, as fast as it goes. You set the throttle against the stop. You roll out slowly. And this motion of going wide open to brake as opposed to wide open, brake, can make a huge difference in the stability of your motorcycle on the entrance. Again, we're talking a subtle difference of letting it snap free and setting it against the stop. So you can do this in two places where it can pay you back quite a bit. One, as you roll off into those big braking zones. Give yourself a little bit of less momentum so that you can be more controlled in the initial part of the brake zone and have higher ultimate brake pressure, again, by setting the throttle against the stop. If you're going into a fast corner where you're coming off a fast straightaway and you enter the corner bending in on the throttle and then roll off while you have some bar input, chassis stability is paramount there. And I will often do a 1 to 2 second roll off, and you'll find that the control you have on the way in will greatly add to your roll speed to the middle of the corner and give yourself the ability to brake as you stand the bike up. But if you pitch the bike off quickly, you shut off all at once, the ability to come into the corner under control and have the ability to make the apex, your ability to precisely find direction, can be diminished with just a little bit of chassis motion up and down. So on those long, fast corner entrances, I'll exaggerate this setting against the throttle where it won't just take, boom, I'll go 1/1000, 2/1000. And as you go from 100% to 90 to 80 to 70% throttle, you find your bike is still accelerating. And the slight difference in acceleration might make 1 mile an hour difference. You can carry 2 or 3 more extra mile an hour through the big part of the turn because your bike is in so much more control. It's give a little bit to get a lot more later. Of course, there are many other facets that affect corner entry. Body position, downshifting, lines, all that kind of thing. For this video, we're going to focus on creating the maximum amount of stability we can with our brakes, both in our ability to carry speed into fast corners and our ability to get to maximum brake pressure in important braking zones. This small little tool has made a huge difference in my ability to have precision and to maximize my corner entrances. Next time you're out on the track, be sure your initial application is smooth so you can get the maximum pressure and that you set that throttle against the stop instead of slam it. And until next time, ride fast, ride safe.